Parents, 1942. Within a week, the evacuation of Bainbridge Island was already old news. Within a month, it was almost forgotten, on the surface anyway. Everyone was doing their best to go about business as usual. Even Henry felt the restless calm as Keiko made plans for lunch on Saturday. She had surprised him by calling his home. Henry's father had answered the phone. As soon as she spoke in English, he handed the receiver to Henry. His father didn't ask who it was, just asked if it was a girl, knowing full well the answer. I guess he just wanted to hear it from my lips, thought Henry. Yes, it's a girl, was all he offered. The words came out in meaningless English, but he nodded and explained, She's my friend. His father looked confused, yet seemingly resigned to the fact that his son was practically in his teens. Back in China, the old country, marriages happened as early as 13 or 14. Sometimes they were arranged at birth, but only for the very poor or the very rich. His father would probably be more concerned if he knew the purpose of the call. To meet Keiko's family. No, Henry realized concern was too gentle a word. His father would be livid. Henry, on the other hand, was less worried until he realized that lunch might qualify as a date, a thought that made his stomach churn and his palms sweat. He reassured himself that it was nothing fancy, just lunch with the O'Cabeys. At school, things seemed abnormally normal, so restrained and peaceful that he and Keiko didn't know what to think. The other children, even the teachers, seemed unaware of the Japanese exodus from Bainbridge Island. The day had come and gone in relative quiet, almost like it never happened. Lost in the news of the war, that the U.S. and Filipino troops were losing at Bataan and that a Japanese submarine had shelled an oil refinery somewhere in California. Henry's father had become more adamant than ever that Henry wear his button. On the outside, wear it on the outside where everyone can see it, his father demanded in Cantonese, and Henry was heading out the door. Henry unzipped his coat and left it open so the button was plainly visible, slumping his shoulders, awaiting his father's stern approval. He had never seen his father so serious before. His parents even went one step further, each wearing an identical button. Some sort of collective effort, Henry reasoned. He understood his parents' concern for his own well-being, but there was no way that they'd be mistaken for Japanese, because they rarely left Chinatown. And if they did, there were simply too many people to round up in Seattle. Thousands. Henry and Keiko's plan was to meet in front of the Panama Hotel. It had been built 30 years earlier by Sabra Ozasa, some architect that Henry's father had mentioned once or twice. Japanese, but of some renown, according to Henry's father anyway, who rarely acknowledged anything in the Japanese community in a positive light, this being the rare exception. The hotel was the most impressive building in Nahanmachi, or the entire district for that matter. Standing as a sentinel between two distinct communities, it provided a comfortable home for people fresh off the boat, rooming by the week or the month, as long as it took to find a job, to save a little money and to become an American. Henry wondered how many immigrants had rested their weary heads at the Panama Hotel, dreaming of a new life that began the day they stepped off the steamship from Canton or Okinawa, counting the days until they could send for their families, days that usually turned to years. Now the hotel stood as a run-down shell of its former glory. Immigrants, fishermen, and cannery workers who weren't allowed to bring their families with them from the old country used it as a permanent bachelor hotel. Henry had always wanted to go down to the lower level, to see the two marble bathhouses, the Sento, Keiko had called them. They were supposedly the largest and most luxurious on the West Coast, but he was too scared. Almost as scared as he was to tell his parents he was meeting Keiko. He'd hinted to his mother, in English no less, that he had a Japanese friend, and she had immediately shot him her stink eye, a look of shock so profound he immediately dropped the subject. Most Chinese parents were indifferent to the Japanese or the Filipinos who arrived daily, fleeing the wars, seeking better fortunes in America. Some Chinese harbored ill feelings, but most simply kept to themselves. His parents were different. They checked his shirt for an I am Chinese button every time he walked out the door. Father's nationalistic pride, his banner of protection, just kept swelling. When he walked Keiko home, a polite wave or an occasional hello to her parents was about as far as Henry got. He had been certain his father would somehow find out, so he kept his visits to a minimum. Keiko, on the other hand, gushed to her parents about her friend Henry, his musical entrance, and about wanting to meet for lunch today. Henry! There she was, sitting on the front steps, waving. An early spring was showing signs of new life, and cherry blossoms were beginning to bloom. The streets, lined in pink and white flowers, finally smelled of something other than seaweed, salty fish, and low tide. I could be Chinese too, she teased him, pointing at Henry's button. Hui noi man jin. It means, how are you today, beautiful, in Cantonese. How did you learn that? Keiko smiled. I looked up at the library. Oda daki irashi desu, Henry returned. For an awkward moment, they just looked at each other beaming, not knowing what to say or in which language to say it. Then Keiko broke the silence. My family's shopping in the market. We'll meet them for lunch. They raced to the Japanese market to meet her parents. He let her win, a courteous gesture his father would have expected of him. And of course, Henry didn't know where he was going anyway. He followed her to the lobby of the Japanese noodle shop, recently named the American Garden. Henry, so nice to see you again. Mr. Okabe wore gray flannel pants and a hat that made him look like Cary Grant. Like Keiko, he spoke beautiful English. The manager sat them at the round table near the window. Keiko sat across from Henry while her mother found a booster seat for Keiko's little brother. Henry's guessed he must have been all of 3 or 4. He was playing with his black lacquered chopsticks, his mother scolding him gently, telling him it was bad luck. Thanks for walking Keiko home every day, Henry. We appreciate you being such a conscientious friend. Henry wasn't exactly sure what conscientious meant, but as Mr. Okabe said it, he poured him a cup of green tea, so he took it as a compliment. Henry took the cup of tea with both hands, a sign of respect his mother taught him, and offered to fill Mr. Okabe's cup. But Keiko's father had already begun pouring his own, using the marble lazy Susan to work his way around the table. Thank you for inviting me. Henry wished he'd paid more attention in English class. Until he was 12, he had been forbidden to speak English in his own home. His father had wanted him to grow up Chinese, the way he had done. Now everything was upside down. Yet the cadence of his words seemed to have more in common with that of the fishermen who came over from China than with the English Keiko and her family who spoke so fluently. That's an interesting button you have on, Henry. Keiko's mother observed in a sweet grandmotherly way. Where did you get it? Reaching up, Henry covered it with his hand. He'd meant to take it off on the way, but had forgotten it at the race to the restaurant. My father gave it to me. He said I'm supposed to wear it at all times. It's embarrassing. No, your father is right. He's a very wise man, Mr. Okabe said. You wouldn't think that if you met him. You shouldn't be ashamed of who you are, never more than right now. Henry looked at Keiko, wondering what she thought about this conversation. She just smiled and kicked him under the table, obviously feeling more at home here than in the school cafeteria. It's easy to be who you are here, but it's harder at school, said Henry. At Rainier, I mean. What am I saying? It's hard being who I am in my own house, with my own family, he thought. Mr. Okabe sipped his tea, reminding Henry to sip his own. It was lighter, with a flavor more subtle and transparent than the black oolong teas his father favored. I knew going to a Caucasian school was going to present certain challenges for Keiko, Mr. Okabe said. But we tell her, be who you are, no matter what. I warned her that they may never like her. Some might even hate her, but eventually they will respect her, as an American. Henry liked where the conversation was going, but he felt a little guilty too, wondering about his own family. Why hadn't anyone ever explained it in that way? Instead, he got a button and was forced to speak as American. There's a free outdoor jazz concert on Jackson Street tonight. Oscar Holden will be playing, Keiko's mother said. Why don't you invite your family to join us? Henry looked at Keiko, who was smiling and raising her eyebrows. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He'd seen Oscar Holden only that one time with Keiko. He heard him a few times before that, but only by pressing his ear to the back alley door of the Black Elks Club, where the legendary jazz pianist happened to be practicing. The offer was tempting, especially since he'd seen so little of Sheldon now that he was stubbing for Oscar's usual sax man, a once-in-a-lifetime gig. Sheldon had called it, indeed. But unlike Keiko's parents, Henry didn't care for colored music. In fact, they didn't seem to listen to music at all anymore. Classical or modern, black or white, the only thing they listened to on the radio these days was the news. It was a kind offer from the Okabes, but once he'd have to decline. Henry could picture the scene like a 10-cent horror matinee at the Atlas Theater, complete with Chinese subtitles, a dark tragedy springing to life as he explained that not only did he have a Japanese friend, but her whole family wanted to take his to a jazz concert. Before he could fake a polite answer to Mr. Okabe, a half-empty bottle of shuyu began skipping around the table. Henry grabbed it and felt the ground tremble. Through the rattling window, he could see a large deuce-and-a-half army truck belching black diesel fumes as it rumbled into the square, its metal frame creaking and piercing the lumbering thunder of its massive engine. Even before its gas brakes squealed, people on the street began scattering in all directions. Only the very old or the very young stayed to observe the truckload of soldiers who sat stoically in the back of the massive rig. More trucks kept coming, one after another, unloading American soldiers and military police with rifles to begin canvassing the neighborhood, nailing small posters to doors, storefronts, and telephone poles. Merchants and customers alike poured out to see the commotion. Henry and the Okabe stepped into the sidewalk as soldiers walked past, handing out copies of the flyer. Public Proclamation 1. which was written in English and Japanese. Henry looked at the paper and